Have you ever looked at a person and thought you had them all figured out? Judge the book by its cover, the soul by its shoes, the entire story by a single, crumpled page. We all have. It's a flaw in our design, a shortcut our minds take to make sense of a complicated world. But what happens when that shortcut leads you off a cliff? What happens when the person you dismiss is the one person you should have been trying to impress? This is a story about that moment. The moment when a world of prejudice and assumption collides with a truth so powerful, it shatters everything you thought you knew. It begins, as so many of these lessons do, in a place where wealth and status are served on a silver platter. The restaurant was called the Gilded Cage, a name dripping with an irony lost on most of its patrons. It was a cathedral of modern opulence, where low lights glinted off polished chrome and every clink of silverware was a note in a symphony of success. At a corner table, nestled in a plush velvet booth, sat Beatrice Vance. She was a portrait of inherited privilege, draped in a dress that cost more than a car and adorned with jewelry that whispered of old money. Her face, a carefully constructed mask of boredom and disdain, scanned the room not with interest, but with the critical eye of a queen inspecting her subjects. Across from her, her father, Alistair Vance, was a monolith of corporate stress. His suit was impeccable, his posture rigid, but his eyes were glued to the glowing screen of his phone, his thumb swiping through streams of data that were, at that moment, infinitely more important than his daughter's monologue of complaints. The wine was too tart, the lighting too dim, the ambient music a half-tone flat. Beatrice's world was a collection of minute imperfections that only she was perceptive enough to notice. Into this carefully curated bubble of dissatisfaction walked Lara. She wore the restaurant's simple uniform, black trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a dark apron tied neatly at her waist. Her hair was pulled back in a severe but practical bun, and her face was clear of makeup, revealing a quiet intensity in her dark eyes. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of hard work, a silent grace that went entirely unnoticed. The narrator of this scene, a silent observer, would have you look down, past the starched apron, past the perfectly creased trousers, to her feet. On her feet she wore a pair of simple, black flats. They were unadorned, practical, and to a casual eye unremarkable. To an eye like Beatrice's they were an offense. They were, in a word, cheap. Lara approached the table, a small notepad in her hand, her expression one of serene professionalism. "Good evening," she began, her voice calm and steady. "My name is Lara. May I start you with our sommelier's recommendation for the evening?" Beatrice didn't even look up from her critical survey of a nearby floral arrangement. "Just bring the 82 Lafite. And don't dawdle." Alistair grunted an affirmation from behind his phone. Lara gave a slight nod, her composure unruffled. She was a ghost in this world, a functional part of the machinery, meant to be unheard and unseen. The role suited her, for now. It was a cloak of invisibility she wore by choice, a shield that allowed her to observe, to learn, to remember. For in her world, the most important work was done in the shadows, far from the blinding glare of the Gilded Cage. The first crack in the evening's facade appeared as a tiny, crimson drop. As Lara placed a bread basket on the table, Beatrice gestured dismissively with a flick of her wrist, her heavy bracelet catching the stem of her water glass. A splash of water hit the tablecloth, a minor inconvenience. Beatrice, however, reacted as if she'd been personally assaulted. "Watch what you're doing!" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This is Egyptian cotton. Do you have any idea how much this tablecloth costs?" Lara paused, her hand hovering over the basket. She looked at the small, damp spot, then back at Beatrice's indignant face. "My apologies, miss," she said, her voice even. "I will have it replaced immediately." But Beatrice was not interested in solutions, she was interested in blame. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as they fell upon Lara's shoes. It was as if she had been searching for a target, a focal point for her free-floating dissatisfaction, and had finally found it. A slow, cruel smile spread across her lips. "You know," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, I should have known better than to expect competence. One look at your shoes says it all. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger. Where did you even find those? The $5 bargain bin? How can you possibly work in a place of taste and refinement when you have absolutely none of your own? The insult hung in the air, thick and ugly. Other diners, sensing the shift in atmosphere, began to cast subtle glances toward the Vance table. Alistair finally looked up, his brow furrowed in annoyance, not at the insult, but at the public nature of his daughter's tantrum. Beatrice, that's enough, he muttered, his attention already drifting back to his screen. Elara stood perfectly still. The world seemed to slow down. She felt the sting of the words, not as a personal wound, but as an old, familiar ache. She had heard variations of this sentiment her whole life. The dismissive glance, the curled lip, the silent judgment that declared her unworthy based on the fabric of her coat or the state of her shoes. But something was different now. The woman standing in this uniform was not the girl who had once cried over such barbs. Inside the quiet waitress, a titan of industry held her breath. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes, not anger, not shame, but a profound and weary disappointment. She simply absorbed the blow, her posture unchanged, her dignity a silent, invisible shield. I will get you a new tablecloth, she repeated softly, and turned to walk away, each step in her supposedly cheap shoes a quiet declaration of a war Beatrice didn't even know she had just declared. The world saw a waitress in cheap shoes. But the truth was a secret kept not out of shame, but out of principle. The woman they called Elara was, in fact, Elara Vansea, the enigmatic founder and CEO of Ethel Fashion House, one of the most innovative and disruptive forces the industry had seen in decades. Her story was not one of inheritance, but of invention. It began not in a boardroom, but in a cramped, third-floor walk-up apartment that always smelled of damp plaster and scorched fabric. It began with her grandmother's sewing machine, a heavy, black iron beast that she had painstakingly restored. While other girls her age were chasing trends, Elara was deconstructing them. She saw fashion not as a statement of wealth, but as a form of armor for the everyday warrior. She saw the nurse on her feet for a 12-hour shift, the teacher commanding a classroom, the mother juggling groceries and a toddler. She saw women whose lives demanded resilience, and she believed their clothing should rise to meet that demand. Her first creation wasn't a gown, but a pair of work trousers, made from a fabric she'd spent months developing in her tiny kitchen, testing swatches in boiling water and rubbing them with sandpaper. They were stain-resistant, wrinkle-proof, and tailored to move with the body, not constrict it. She called her nascent company Ethel, an old word for noble, for she believed there was a nobility in hard work, a quiet grace and perseverance that deserved to be honored. She built her empire stitch by stitch, pattern by pattern. She took a job as a cleaner in a design firm just to salvage fabric scraps from their dumpsters. She worked as a barista to listen to women talk about their lives, their frustrations, their needs. And once a year, every year, since her company had become a multi-million-dollar success, she did this. She shed the identity of Elara Vansea, CEO, and became just Elara, the waitress, the hotel maid, the retail clerk. She called it her grounding. It was a ritual to remind herself of the world she was designing for, to never lose touch with the reality of the people she served. It was her way of ensuring that Ethel never became another gilded cage, beautiful on the outside but empty within. The shoes Beatrice had mocked were the crown jewel of her upcoming dignity line. They were the product of 2 years of research and development. The simple exterior hid a marvel of ergonomic engineering, a sole designed by a podiatrist, an insole made of a proprietary memory foam that molded to the wearer's foot, and an upper crafted from a revolutionary synthetic polymer she had invented. This material was breathable, waterproof, stain-proof, and possessed a subtle elegance that was meant to be discovered, not flaunted. They were not cheap. A single pair cost more to manufacture than the entirety of Beatrice's designer outfit. They were priceless, not because of a brand name, but because of the idea they represented, that true value is intrinsic, woven into the very fabric of a thing, not stamped on a label. As she walked back to the kitchen, Elara felt the familiar weight of her double life. She was a queen disguised as a commoner, and the disguise was, at this moment, both a burden and a source of profound clarity. Beatrice's insult was not just an insult, it was a gift. It was raw, unfiltered market data. It was proof of the very prejudice she was trying to combat. It strengthened her resolve. The world needed Ethel. The world needed a lesson in seeing beyond the surface. And she, Elara, was about to deliver it. Back at the table, Alistair Vance finally pocketed his phone. His daughter's outburst had created a ripple of discomfort in their section of the restaurant, and it was bad for business to be the center of such negative attention. He was about to scold Beatrice for her lack of decorum when Elara returned, a fresh tablecloth folded over her arm. He watched her as she expertly cleared the table and refitted the cloth, her movements precise and efficient. He was a man who had built his own empire, not through inheritance but through shrewd observation and a ruthless eye for talent. He recognized competence when he saw it, and this waitress possessed it in spades. She was calm under fire, dignified in the face of insult, and moved with a purpose that seemed out of place. His gaze drifted down to her shoes. He wasn't a fashion expert, but he was an investor. He'd spent the last quarter reviewing dozens of pitches from up-and-coming apparel companies. His firm, Vance Capital, was desperately searching for the next big thing, a brand with innovation at its core. As he looked at the simple black flats, something stirred in his memory. The clean, unbroken line from the toe to the heel, the unique, matte texture of the material, the way it seemed to hug her foot without creasing. It was strangely familiar. He remembered a design sketch in a prospectus he'd received a few weeks ago. A company called Ethel. They were notoriously private, their founder a complete enigma, but their product designs were revolutionary. The prospectus had included a section on a new line of footwear, featuring a proprietary material that was supposedly indestructible. He had dismissed it as marketing hyperbole at the time. Now, he wasn't so sure. "Where did you get those shoes?" he asked, the question abrupt. Beatrice rolled her eyes, assuming her father was joining in on her mockery. "Dad, don't bother. They're probably a knockoff of a knockoff." Elara finished smoothing the tablecloth and looked directly at Alistair. For the first time, their eyes met, and he saw a depth there that startled him. It was not the gaze of a subordinate. It was the gaze of an equal. "They were a gift," she said simply, her voice betraying nothing. But Alistair was hooked. The puzzle pieces were starting to drift closer in his mind. The quiet confidence, the unusual shoes, the name he couldn't quite place. He was a predator who had caught a new and interesting scent on the wind. "You handle yourself well under pressure," he stated, less a compliment than an observation. "Have you worked here long?" "Long enough," Elara replied, her answer a polite deflection. Beatrice let out an exasperated sigh. "Father, are you seriously interviewing the help? Can we please just order? Some of us are starving." She waved a dismissive hand at Elara. We'll have the Chateaubriand. And another bottle of the Lafite." Before Elara could move, Beatrice, in a final, petulant act of dominance, swung her legs out of the booth. Whether by accident or design, her sharp-heeled shoe connected squarely with the side of her full wine glass. The glass tipped, not onto the pristine new tablecloth, but in a perfect, slow-motion arc directly toward Elara. The deep, red liquid splashed across the front of Elara's apron and cascaded down onto the very shoes that had been the subject of so much scorn. A collective gasp came from the surrounding tables. Beatrice's lips curled into a triumphant smirk. She had finally managed to break through the waitress's infuriating composure. She expected an outcry, a flustered panic, perhaps even tears of frustration. She was about to be severely disappointed. The entire incident was a calculated act of cruelty, a final attempt by Beatrice to assert her dominance, and humiliate the woman who had so thoroughly unnerved her. She wanted a reaction. She wanted to see the waitress crumble, to prove that her own lofty position in the world gave her the power to ruin someone's day, someone's uniform, someone's composure. The red wine, dark as blood, should have been a disaster. On any normal fabric, it would have been an instant, permanent stain, a mark of shame. But these were not normal shoes. Elara looked down at the splash of crimson. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, with the same deliberate calm she had displayed all evening, she reached for a clean napkin from the table. Beatrice watched, her smirk unwavering, expecting a futile dabbing that would only smear the stain. Instead, something incredible happened. As Elara gently wiped the surface of her shoe, the wine didn't smear. It didn't soak in. The droplets beaded up on the matte black material, like rain on a freshly waxed car, and rolled right off, leaving the surface perfectly clean and dry. Not a single mark remained. The silent, powerful demonstration was more stunning than any verbal retort could ever have been. The smirk vanished from Beatrice's face, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. "What? How did you do that?" she stammered. Alistair Vance leaned forward, his eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated fascination. He wasn't seeing a waitress cleaning a spill anymore. He was witnessing a live product demonstration of impossible technology. The memory of the ethyl prospectus slammed into the forefront of his mind. Hydrophobic nanocoating, resilient polymer weave, the future of functional fashion. It wasn't hyperbole. It was real. And it was on the feet of the waitress his daughter had just been mocking. "What are those things made of?" Beatrice demanded, her voice a mixture of awe and accusation. "Plastic?" Elara finished her calm wipe, folded the napkin, and looked up. She met Beatrice's stunned gaze, but her words were directed at Alistair. "Something much stronger," she said. Her voice was quiet, yet it resonated with an authority that filled the sudden silence at their table. The commotion had finally drawn the attention of the restaurant manager, Mr. Davies. He was a man who moved through the world with a permanent cringe, his primary function to placate the wealthy and scold the powerless. Seeing the Vances, his most high-profile customers, at the center of a scene sent him scurrying over, his face a mask of panicked apology. He saw the situation through the lens of established hierarchy. A rich, important patron was upset, and a low-level employee was standing there. The conclusion was obvious. "Miss Vance! Mr. Vance! I am so terribly sorry for this disturbance," he began, bowing slightly and completely ignoring Elara. He turned on her, his voice dropping to a harsh, accusatory whisper. "What is going on here? You are creating a scene. Our guests are trying to enjoy a peaceful dinner. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't investigate. He simply assigned blame based on uniform." This was the moment of maximum pressure for Elara. She was trapped in her role, publicly admonished by her supposed superior, and silently judged by a room full of strangers. This was the crucible. She could either retreat into the role of the shamed waitress, apologize for something that was not her fault, and allow the injustice to stand. Or she could drop the disguise. Alistair watched intently. He saw the manager's reflexive condescension, his daughter's bewildered shock, and the waitress's unnerving stillness. He was a shark that sensed blood in the water, but he was also a connoisseur of character. He wanted to see how she would play this hand. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on Elara, giving her the stage. Mr. Davies continued his tirade. "Go to the back. Now. We will discuss your future employment later." He turned back to Beatrice, his smile oily and apologetic. "The rest of your meal will be on the house, of course. Anything you desire." It was the ultimate dismissal. Elara was no longer a person, but a problem to be removed. The entire system was designed to protect the Beatrice Vances of the world and discard the Elaras. But the system was about to encounter a fatal error. The woman it was trying to discard was the one who owned the game. A quiet transformation occurred. Elara straightened her posture, and though she grew no taller, her presence seemed to expand, filling the space around her. The demure, subservient shell of the waitress dissolved, revealing the unshakable core of the CEO beneath. The shift was so palpable that Mr. Davies stopped his fawning mid-sentence. Elara turned her head slowly, not to the manager who had just threatened her job, but to the man with the real power. She looked directly into Alastair Vance's eyes. The observer had become the observed, and now, she was taking control of the narrative. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice no longer soft but crisp and clear, imbued with a boardroom authority that cut through the restaurant's murmur. "Your company, Vance Capital, has been trying to schedule a meeting with the CEO of Ethel Fashion House for the past 3 months. My assistant has informed me your office has called 6 times. The air crackled. Alastair Vance froze, his face a mask of dawning comprehension. The name. Ethel. The shoes. The impossible material. The unshakable poise. It all coalesced in his mind with the force of a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face as the impossible truth began to settle. Beatrice, still reeling from the magical wine-repelling shoes, let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Ethel? What would a waitress know about Ethel? Don't be ridiculous. She probably read the name in a magazine." She looked to her father for support, but found none. He was staring at Elara as if he had just seen a ghost. Elara did not spare Beatrice a glance. Her focus was entirely on Alastair. She then turned her head slightly, her gaze falling upon the now silent and confused Mr. Davies. "And Mr. Davies," she continued, her tone dangerously calm, "the owner of this fine establishment, Mr. Dubois, is a very dear friend of mine. We sit on a charity board together. He is currently waiting for my annual report on the customer service experience here at the Gilded Cage. This evening has been extraordinarily illuminating." The manager's face went from ruddy to a sickly, pale white. He looked from Elara to Mr. Vance and back again, his mind struggling to process the cataclysmic inversion of power that was happening before his very eyes. The waitress he was about to fire held his entire career in the palm of her hand. The full weight of the revelation descended upon the table. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated shock. The world had been turned upside down. The servant was the master. The judge was the judge. Alastair Vance, a man rarely caught off guard, felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. He had been searching for the elusive, brilliant mind behind Ethel, the hottest investment target in the fashion world, and she had been standing right in front of him, serving him bread, while his own daughter mocked her footwear. The dramatic irony was so thick he could taste it. Beatrice's mind simply refused to accept it. Her entire worldview was predicated on a simple, rigid hierarchy. Expensive labels meant importance, a uniform meant insignificance. The idea that the woman in the cheap shoes held the key to a business deal her father had been chasing for months was not just unlikely, it was impossible. It violated the fundamental laws of her universe. "You're lying," she whispered, the words lacking any conviction. "You're a waitress. This is some kind of pathetic trick." Elara finally turned her gaze to Beatrice. There was no anger in her eyes, no triumph. Only a deep, profound pity. She reached into the small, hidden pocket of her apron and slowly, deliberately, began to untie the strings. The simple act was imbued with immense symbolic power. She was shedding the robe, casting off the cloak of invisibility. She folded the apron with the same precision she had used on the tablecloth and placed it on the edge of the table. Then, she looked down at her feet. "These are not cheap shoes, Miss Vance," she said, her voice resonating with the passion of a creator speaking of her life's work. "They are a promise. A promise that a woman's strength should not be compromised by her comfort. That her work has dignity. That her worth is not measured by a price tag, but by the miles she walks and the burden she carries." Her hand went into her trouser pocket and emerged with a single, startlingly elegant business card. It was made of a thick, textured stock, the color of slate. On it, in minimalist silver lettering, were only 2 words. Elara. Ethel. She stepped forward and placed the card gently on the table, directly in front of Alastair. The silence in the restaurant was now absolute. Every diner, every staff member, was frozen, watching the silent, breathtaking drama unfold. "My office will contact yours in the morning," Elara stated, her voice returning to its cool, executive tone. She looked Alastair directly in the eye. We can discuss whether a potential partnership is still a good fit for our brand's values. The unspoken implication was clear: the deal was no longer his for the taking. It was hers to grant. With that, she turned. Head held high, back straight, she walked away from the table. The sound of her footsteps on the polished marble floor was the only sound in the cavernous room. And every person in that restaurant, from the busboys to the wealthiest patrons, watched her go, their eyes fixed on the simple black shoes that had just brought an empire to its knees. The aftermath was a tableau of silent ruin. Elara disappeared through the kitchen doors, leaving a vacuum in her wake. The spell was broken, but the consequences lingered like smoke. Alistair Vance stared at the business card on the table as if it were a sacred relic. He slowly reached out and picked it up, his fingers tracing the embossed letters. He looked at his daughter Beatrice, and for the first time, he saw her not as his heir, but as a liability. He saw the shallowness, the cruelty, the profound ignorance that he had enabled, and a wave of shame washed over him. He had been so engrossed in his world of numbers and deals that he had failed to teach her the most important lesson of all: the currency of character is worth more than all the money in the world. Beatrice sat as if turned to stone, her face pale, her eyes wide with the horror of her own actions. The carefully constructed walls of her privilege had been demolished. The woman she had tried to humiliate had, with a few quiet words, utterly dismantled her. She had mocked the very thing her family had been desperate to acquire. The humiliation was total. It was a public, undeniable, and deeply personal failure. In that moment, a crack appeared in her cynical facade, and for the first time, she felt the cold, sharp edge of true consequence. "Father," she began, her voice a choked whisper, but the words died in her throat. What could she possibly say? There was no apology that could bridge the chasm she had just created. Alistair didn't answer. He simply looked up from the card and watched the swinging kitchen doors. He wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. He was seeing the future of an industry, a force of nature he had almost missed. He had come to the gilded cage for a meal, but he had found something far more valuable, a lesson. He had found his hidden gem, and in the process, had discovered a rot within his own house. The path forward was uncertain. The Ethel deal, which he had considered a top priority, was now in jeopardy, contingent on the grace of a woman his daughter had treated like dirt. His own values, his own leadership, had been called into question. He had been so blind, so disconnected, that he hadn't recognized genius when it was pouring him water. That evening, Alistair Vance's transformation began. He moved from a state of passive ignorance to one of active introspection. He understood that his daughter's behavior was a reflection of his own failings, and that before he could fix his business, he had to fix his family. The journey would be long, but it started here, with a simple business card and the ghost of a pair of well-made shoes. So, we return to the question we started with. Have you ever judged a book by its cover? The story of Elara is not just a story about a mistaken identity. It is a mirror. It forces us to confront the biases we carry, the snap judgments we make every single day. True worth is not loud. It is not flashy. It is not defined by the label on your clothes or the price of your shoes. It is quiet, it is resilient, and it is often found in the most unexpected of places. It is the dignity of the cleaner, the wisdom of the elder, the quiet strength of the person who serves you. The most valuable assets in our world are not traded on the stock market. They are the integrity, creativity, and character hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the heart and the wisdom to see them. Elara did not need Alistair Vance's validation. She had already built her own kingdom based on a foundation of respect and innovation. But by revealing herself, she gave him, and his daughter, a far greater gift than a business deal: a chance at redemption. A chance to see the world not for what it appears to be, but for what it truly is: a place full of hidden geniuses, quiet heroes, and overlooked virtuosos. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that every person we meet is carrying a history we cannot see. Remind them that a moment of kindness can change a day, and a moment of cruelty can reveal a lifetime of ignorance. Look closer. listen better. And the next time you are tempted to judge someone by their appearance, pause. Remember the waitress in the cheap shoes. And ask yourself, what story am I failing to see? What will you do differently tomorrow,